Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon to those of you further east. My name is EJ Bryn, and I am the Senior Manager of Strategic Initiatives and Stakeholder Engagement at the BC Council for International Education, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to a critical intercultural approach to developing and reimagining your programs. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And it is my true honor to invite Carlene Thomas back as a member of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation to do our opening for this webinar. Carlene, over to you.
Thank you, EJ. OCM ni siya ay tanishkwalawan. Kwatsi kutsnala ihi anta ansakhalot. Anta mana santaya siya slahot siam. Anta imat kwat ansakhalot. Slahot siam. Equet squestemostok. Equet halat. Hai tsepka meet sep fushwilam homaskuyam. Prohotmish. Sewata tamat. Tla Lofongden Songis Kwamoch. So what I said to you, everyone, in my little bit of language I know called Hankamitnam or Downriver Halkmalam, my respected ones, the feelings I have are so good. I feel so good to be with you here today. It actually says to see you and be here with you, but this modern technology, I'm telling you, I couldn't get the video working, so you're just hearing my voice today. I introduced myself to you with my ancestral name. I carry the name Ansafalot. It was given to me by my paternal grandmother when I was a much younger woman. And in Coast Salish Way, I shared a little bit of my family tree, and we do that for a number of reasons. But the most important is that it informs you, the audience, that I know who I am. I know where I come from. And being a Welmochta, I carry that responsibility much, much deeper. I am a grandmother of 5. So my parents are Ernie and Deanna George. My father is the current hereditary leader of our people. My grandparents are the late hereditary chief John L. George and the late Lillian or Dolly George, as she was known to her friends. And recently I've been acknowledging my maternal grandparents. And you know, I'm going to be 60 in a few days, and I've been doing this for at least 35, 40 years, and I've never acknowledged my maternal grandparents, and it really bothered me. And I think upon reflection, I realized, you know, when we were put on reserves, our families were separated and we were told, you're Musqueam, you're Squamish, you're Tsleil-Waututh, and it set us against each other. We were fighting against each other and we forgot. So it does me proud to mention that my maternal grandparents are the late Stan Joseph from the Squamish Nation and the late Caroline Nee Thomas Nee Trimble from the Snuneymuxw or the Nanaimo people and the Nisga'a people. And if you could see me, the next part I'm saying, Hi Tsepka, raise my hands. It's a gesture of welcome. Hi Tsepka, thanking all of you. Meet Tsepwitwilam, and I'm welcoming you here to the homelands and waters of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Today, however, I am visiting the beautiful city of Victoria, so I acknowledge that I'm in the homelands and waters of the Lakwandin people and the Songhees here on Vancouver Island. I'm very honored and acknowledge the organizers for reaching out to do this type of protocol, because when you start talking about indigenizing curriculum, indigenizing institutes, it's so important to start building that relationship with the Indigenous peoples from your hometown. It's important to acknowledge their presence there, and we all carry a shahalmas, we all carry that sacred obligation to stand up for and to protect our rights and interests in the lands of our ancestors. So I wish you well on your journey during these webinars, and next time hopefully we'll have I'll be able to actually kind of see you in person on the Zoom. So with that, I will say thank you once more and hand it back to you, EJ.
Thank you, Carlene. We're so grateful for your welcome again this morning, and I also want to thank you for sharing your history with us. Recognizing that many of us are logged in from all over the country and even a few outside of the country, I encourage you all to take a moment and look around. Acknowledge where you are in the territorial history of the lands you're on. If you don't know what lands you are on, I invite you to find out after this webinar. So if you can take a moment, please. So just a reminder that this webinar is part of an intercultural series that runs once a month through May. You can find more details about the upcoming webinar and review the foundations modules that we encourage all of you to complete prior to the webinars on our website. You can also learn about the certificate of completion on there as well. Tara Lynn has just put a direct link to our webpage in the question box for easy reference. Thanks, Tara Lynn. Now I'm going to hand over the microphone to Todd Odgers, who is the Associate Dean of International at BCIT and is the moderator for the entire webinar series. He will introduce the speakers for today. So Todd, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and thank you very much, Carlene, for your welcome. And I'd like to acknowledge that I also will live and work on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people. That I live and work on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I hope that I'm able to not just derive benefit, but pass on and generate benefit back to this territory through the work that we do together. Then in the past month, we had a really great session with Dr. Kyra Garson, and you can see some of the stickies that we came up with at the end of the session that were highlights of what people wanted to take home after the session and see what they could maybe either investigate or undertake or initiate as a result of what they had learned from the session. And you know, working with Kyra, we went through a progression. We talked a little bit about a progression of how internationalization moved to interculturalization, and we went through a number of stages. We've gone through a number of stages since the 1970s, and that is in the foundations modules associated also with this program. We looked at the new night definition that was also influenced by DeWitt, Hunter, and some other researchers, and how that's morphed and changed over time with influence of historical context that we're in right now. And we've looked on the pivotal shift that's happened after 2015, and especially in Canada with the TRC findings and the calls to action, and how that is really strongly influencing internationalization in the way that we, and really questioning the way that we historically have looked at international education. And we spoke increasingly of the complex approaches that people are trying to develop, measure, and validate or to internationalization, such as that by Nesty and Sandhu, which Kyra so kindly shared with us and laid out to us some of the thinking on that. And we all, as you can see, came away, we all went into groups and came away with some interesting takeaways after that. And all of that work, I think Kyra did a really great job of setting up for this week's. We are now going to be talking a little bit about what is that current era that we are in right now. And the three panelists that we have today, you know, we're going to be looking at the tensions and the balances and the challenges that we're facing and the opportunities that we have to engage the systems that we are working in and creating as international educators and working in the field of international, intercultural, and increasingly being influenced locally by indigenization. And as people and professionals, how do we personally engage our work? How do we engage our own positionality? How do we understand our positionality in our work? And how do we work with that? And I think we're going to have a really lively conversation. I'd like to now take some time to introduce the three panelists that we have. You'll see on our website a more in-depth description of their backgrounds. We're really lucky today to have these three, and I don't want to speak too much longer, but I do want to point out some really, I think, some high-level points about each three of them. Dr. Justin Wilson descends from an intercultural background consisting of the Hetzuk, the German, Deutsch, and Guatemalan roots. He's been involved in international education since Indigenous capacity building efforts in provincial and nationally since 1991. Sorry, Justin, I misread my notes there. And he's co-chair of the Federation of Post-Secondary Educators for Decolonization. His recent works include pulling together a guide for indigenization of post-secondary institutions and looking back to the potlatch as a guide to truth, reconciliation, and transformative learning. And he is currently a faculty of psychology instructor or a professor at the Capilano University and department coordinator of Aboriginal Studies at Langara College here in Vancouver. Dr. Eduardo Contreras, or Eddie, you'll hear us referring to him as Eddie, is at the University of Portland and is Assistant Provost for International Education, Diversity and Inclusion with 15 years in public and private education in the United States post-secondary. He's worked at the University of Texas in Austin, where he spearheaded the first student peer mentor program that promoted inclusion. And at Harvard, he taught a course entitled Internationalization, Higher Education, Possibilities, Perils, and Promises, and was served on the Global Education Task Force as part of the Graduate School of Education to introduce ways to internationalize graduate school of education and education there. And he has presented his work broadly. Darla Deerdorf, probably a name that is well known to all of us, is Executive Director at the Association of International Education Administrators, widely respected and published researcher in the field of international and intercultural education. She's a research scholar with the Social Sciences Research Institute at Duke University, an adjunct professor at North Carolina State University, as well as visiting research professor at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa, Meiji University Research Institute in International Education in Japan, and the Shanghai International Studies University. Finally, because of the quality of work and the range of her work, she's a senior Fulbright specialist to both South Africa and Japan. We are really fortunate to have these folks with us today. I'm hoping that we'll be able to put them on the screen here and we can start our day. Welcome, everyone. What we're going to do today, we're going to go in order today, and we're going to be looking at those tensions. We're starting at that systems level, and then we're going to come down to that personal level. And I think we're starting with you, Justin. I think if we think about our local context, how can international educators, advisors, leaders, mobility specialists, and faculty start to frame their work in relation to what is really an immense task of indigenization and reconciliation in our work?
All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Auntie. Thank you for, I'm going to say some things in English first just to sort of get us kicked off and then talk in my language just for a second. Yityo, sasam umaks wawaktas guklot du himas. Gayasika kasoak nuas eki squalas. Justin Wilson Hiskalanogo Hastock Doguinogo. Gayasika Slewatooth du Skotmash du Musquim. I open that way in the true spirit and respect of offering some things and perspectives today that I come and I'm not here to sit in pristine fashion to anyone. I hope that today we can walk together, and I'd like to dedicate what I'm doing today to Joyce. And I'd like to dedicate what I'm doing today to the Mi'kmaq peoples, to the lynchings that we're seeing and that's happening across our country. Those are some loaded questions. And I think the easiest way to position myself is there seems to be this perception that if you're Indigenous, that you get this pass. Um, I'm situated on someone's unceded and occupied lands. And every day I get up and go to work. Every day I go to sleep. What does that mean? Where my white picket fence dreams become someone else's nightmares. To erase, to minimize. These are very, very violent forms of racism. And I really like what Carlene was saying in terms of our responsibility. Doing this type of work, it's not just resistance, because from my own context, everything I do, as you can see the first slide, I talk about anti-oppression, but I'm not here to propagate I'm here to actually disrupt the narratives, so to speak, because these narratives inside post-secondary, we're talking basically about structural and systemic racism. So, how do I frame this? 4 years ago on this very day, I presented at the British Columbia Truth and Reconciliation Summit hosted by NBIT. When we frame the context of critical intercultural education, I like to think that Stuart Hall spent a lot of time with the Indigenous folk down south, our southern relatives. And I like to take a dignified approach to everything that I do, because these types of conversations are very difficult to have. And as Mary Louise Pratt talks about in the contact zone, this is what I just want to thank the organizers for hosting this, because when we come together like this, it's an opportunity for us to really begin to talk about the embodied inquiries into what we're talking about: the colonization, the objectification, the dehumanization, and also the commodification of Indigenous and BIPOC folk, or even international students for that matter. And we don't have to necessarily frame it as an us-them binary. So, this is one of my favorite quotes of all time from the late Dan George. If the legends fall silent, who will teach the children of our ways? And I really like the word who, because we're talking about power. We're talking about white supremacy inside post-secondary, where individuals are making decisions on behalf of Indigenous folk all the time. And, this can be a very difficult conversation, because we're disrupting the narrative of benevolent paternalism. And that paternalism exists. It's an implicit bias. I've had to decolonize myself. I've had to decolonize my own writing, my own mind, my heart, my scholarship. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank Linda Toy Smith, who's also experiencing structural and systemic racism in New Zealand, as well as some of my colleagues in Saskatchewan, who have all basically resigned due to these challenges. I want to talk a little bit about how we can move beyond this I think the only way I can describe it, Todd, is this: who am I to indigenize you? That was done to many of my relatives. I'm not a big fan of the word indigenization. I think it's a very sophisticated form of domination, potentially, depending on who is doing it. If anything, it's an invitation for us to be human. The late Leonard George actually said that, when we talk about being human, what does that mean? How do we move beyond, truth and reconciliation work as just an informative process? So I like to always frame it within the context of transformative praxis. And that includes operationalizing DRIPA or UNDRIP inside post-secondary. And these are just a couple of examples. Who decides on my cultural and spiritual integrity? And this is what we often don't think about, because in my experience, the money making aspect, the strategic enrollment aspects of commodifying students, it's a going concern. You can pass this one as well. Everyone should have a copy of at the end of this. In essence, I know we're short on time today, but we can't just focus on resistance. One of the things I've learned in terms of critical intercultural scholarship is using my own framework, what's inside my DNA, the things that I have the authority to speak on that no one else does. I call this heistok ka'afini, or equidignity. And this is a combination of educational parity. It's equity inside post-secondary. It's also equanimity, because everything we do, to be a haystock person, to be human, means we have got to be on our best. We're aligning our best cognitions, our best feelings, and contributing to moving forward. And of course, education has got to be done in a dignified way. I've learned in the intercultural aspects that we do that by calling people in. And I love the canoe metaphor. Just the other day, there was a canoe launch, and many of Carlene's relatives were there. It's an invitation to hop into the canoe, grab a paddle, and help row in unison. Practice cultural humility. Can't do that there. In many respects, there are cultural and spiritual accreditations that we in the academy they're largely intangible to us. And this is what's being privileged inside post-secondary. That's why it's structurally racist, is because we are basically silencing these perspectives. We've got to, rather than focus on race, which is a social construct that it was designed to serve exploitation and domination, I like to just simply refer to it as collegial supremacy, because anybody, including Indigenous folk, can be collegial supremacists. Practice nonviolent communication. At the end of the day, it is these types of microaggressions inside the classroom. It's death by 1,000 cuts. Be courageous, as Brene Brown says. Because when we talk about vulnerability, what we're really getting at is acknowledgement of the disenfranchised grief that Indigenous folk and BIPOC folk are feeling inside their bodies, and who decides how we grieve and when. It's a very challenging thing. Finally, develop community based, culturally and spiritually informed interventions with the local folk. Carlene said it very clearly. Get them involved. Institutions like BCCIE, they should have a rotating, permanent elder in residence. At the very least, call it back rent, whatever you want to call. Provide free tuition for some of the local host nations, and maybe if you want to open it up to some of the other Indigenous scholars. So these are some of the things that really come to mind in answering your question. We're all, as Bobby Joe says, we're all Indigenous from somewhere, and we're all reconciling with something. So these are a couple of the tools that have really helped my practice. But make no mistake, no one has the right to speak on my behalf. And yet we privilege a lot of voices inside the academy, and we silence and erase and marginalize others. So again, going back to Dan George's words, who gets to decide? That's a really important question going forward. So these are just a few things that come to mind, Todd.
Well, thank you, Justin, and thank you for raising the piece about equidignity in our warm-up conversations where we were establishing as a group what we were going to talk about. You had raised that word, and it stuck with me ever since. So thank you so much for raising that. And yeah, Eddie, transitioning, you're in a different kind of context. You're in Portland, and with some similarities and differences from the BC context. And I'm wondering, I'm preparing for today, your role is inaugural. Your portfolio is linked with equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm wondering, how do you, in your role as an assistant vice president of provost, do this work that you're doing?
Thank you, Todd, for the question, and thank you, Justin, for the food for thought that you've been giving me since our initial conversations. I am here in Portland, and I just want to briefly acknowledge that the Portland metro area rests on the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Katlamet, Clackamas bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and several other tribes. I'm deeply grateful for the original caretakers of this land, and I am grateful for their ongoing contributions to not only our campus here at the University of Portland, but also in the metro area. You know, the question that you asked, Todd, is not an easy one to answer. Sometimes I don't know how I'm doing, just in a general sense, you know, because it's the work is hard, and in part because, as Justin said, institutions of higher education, post-secondary education, are hierarchical and structured in a way that has been built upon years of white supremacy. And so in order to do work where, as I hope to do, people's voices are being heard, you have to work within the structure of these systems, but you also have to work to dismantle them from within, so to speak. And so one of the frameworks that I've been thinking about is on the slide, with the thinking about institutions that have been mindful of issues, and this is primarily in the U.S. context, but I'm curious to see in the discussion if this holds true. But internationalization is often thought of in one bucket, in one sphere, in one circle, and these are some of the topics that I know have emerged from previous conversations in this series, but that are conversations that are familiar, certainly to the folks that are here, to my esteemed colleagues here on the panel. Another bucket that has emerged, at least in the US context from the 1960s, is the DEI framework that is really centered on issues of identity, right? Using race and ethnicity, race as a socially constructed but powerful concept, but other aspects of identity. And also thinking about ways that institutions are, if we're being proactive about it, honoring the voices, not only of our students, but of our staff and of our faculty, so that the community members who come to campus are being acknowledged, are being heard, and the institutions are serving them in ways that meet their needs, not in ways that meet the needs of the institution. And so I think that the interesting space that we have a chance to occupy, and it feels like this is conversation that's been emerging within this series, is in the unifying aspects of it. So if we look at the center point by just advancing to the next animation here, this is the space where I feel like internationalization and diversity, equity, and inclusion can overlap. And here's the space where I feel that the work that I'm doing at the University of Portland and the work that others are doing in different spaces has, to me, the most urgent impact these days, right? So how can we find dignity in all? How can we use the skills of intercultural educators to understand and know, to the extent that we can ever know, where another person comes from? You know, how can we lead with humility? I love the term that Justin has offered here to us of equidignity. And how can we really focus on our campus climate in ways that is proactive and is engaged in doing this work in the center of these two spheres that are often separate. And then as professionals, as leaders, as faculty, as individuals who are in positions of impact or authority, right? We all have our spheres of influence. How can we advocate for these things? How can we advocate for anti-racist policies? How can we advocate for policies that may sort of alter the system, but will do so in that spirit of calling people in so that we can, voices can be heard and people can be seen. So this is the framework that I've been operating with in this inaugural role here in Portland.
Thank you, Eddie. Yeah, indeed, calling people in. Thank you for that phrase as well, Justin. I think what we'll do is we'll transition here to Darla. And thank you, Eddie, for providing that kind of high-level overview of some of the tensions that you're trying to reconcile in the work that you're doing down in Portland. And Darla, can we transition over to you? And I'm wondering, you're well known in the field. You've worked at a local level, at a national level, but also at some of the higher levels of abstraction. If you think of something small like working for the United Nations, so that something can be applied to globally, no small task. Can you share us just a little bit about how you manage those local, global, and overlapping challenges? And you spend time in Canada, you're working with the story circles here. Can you talk a little bit about this with us today?
Sure. I want to first begin by saying that and acknowledging that I am on the ancestral lands of the Shakori and the Catawba here in North Carolina in the United States. And I'm grateful for the caretakers of this land and to those who have come before. And I'm grateful also to be here with all of you today and for the opportunity to share together. And I really appreciate the comments of my colleagues, Justin and Eddie, and Todd, also your framing remarks in the beginning. So it's been interesting to kind of come full circle in my own journey of what it means to work on the local and global levels in regard to the intercultural competence work, which is indeed more at the individual level as one-on-one work with others. And through that, I am grateful for the opportunity to have been able to work with UNESCO on developing an intercultural methodology that really does, I think, live into what we're talking about today in terms of practicing intercultural competence, yet in community with others. And this particular methodology came about through many conversations and through research and work with others, and acknowledging that so much of the intercultural materials and trainings that are available have come out of the global north, have been imposed on those who are not from the dominant cultures in the global north, and trying to find a way to move beyond that in regard to even the work of UNESCO. And so looking around to other ways of doing and being, this particular methodology is inspired by indigenous traditions on different continents, actually, and it's been just amazing to be able to have the opportunity to work with so many through this methodology. It is called Story Circles, and UNESCO was able to pilot this in all 5 UNESCO regions around the world. And one of the pictures there is from one of the official pilots in Costa Rica. The other is from some work I had done in South Africa. And I am just grateful for the opportunity to have been able to work with others through this. And as you can see from the slide here, it is now available as an open access manual in 5 languages. And because of the pandemic, we are now using this virtually.
Right.
Of course, the pictures are in person, pre-pandemic, but now I'm really glad to be able to use this virtually. And I've actually had the opportunity to use this with Canadian colleagues virtually earlier this summer, and along with others. And in fact, this Friday, UNESCO, we will be doing this as a staff training with UN staff and UNHCR staff, those who work with refugees. And so I'm happy to share more about this, but it's been really important not to draw on some of the traditional resources that have been used for a long time in the global north, and to look at other ways of that we can work toward some of these same goals.
Lovely. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing this too today. And it's great that it's an open resource that we can all access. So I'm pretty sure a lot of people are going to be clicking on there a little bit through the morning to see what there is there. Thank you so much, Darla. And what I would like to do is transition a little bit. So this first round of discussions, I see our time. Yeah, we have enough time. We have about 10, 15 minutes to transition and then take a few questions at the end. Let's try and do this in about 10 minutes. And I'm looking at the first part. We're looking at the sort of that systems level, but now it's looking at. I'd like us to look at our individual level, in our own personal spheres, at our personal level, at the work that we're doing. And I'm wondering, Justin, earlier you spoke of the contact zone. One of the slides that you had up there, you talked about Pratt's contact zone, and you talked about, and you introduced your the equanimity and your 6 C's. And I'm wondering how you make those work for yourself. Where do you engage? Where are the challenges, and where are the how do you approach it with people? How do you translate it to people and work with people around them?
Oof, that's a loaded question, Todd.
Yeah.
First, I just want to take a second to acknowledge Darla. You know, you're one of my sheroes in terms of my why. And I know my why is your why, so to speak. We share a why. I just want to offer that. I consider you not just a colleague, but also an auntie. Well, I can only speak from my embodied inquiry, Todd. It's difficult. Because it's like the epistemic violence and collegial supremacy, collegiality by attrition, collegial voyeurism, all intersect. It's like a boot or a knee on the back of my neck. You know, I think Eduardo called it. It is capitalism. It's individualism. It's exploitation. It's dominance. It's organizational bullying. It's mobbing. And that's totally not why I joined the academy. You know, collegiality is characterized by the enactment of pro-social, community-centered, respectful behavior that facilitates cooperative growth and prosperity inside institutions designed to cultivate free, unfettered inquiry. So for me, it's not just academic freedom, it's cultural freedom. You know, Murray Sinclair said it best: educators, I'm part of that system, got us into this mess, and it has to be transformative education that gets us out. And when people speak truth to the power that Eduardo is talking about, they are emotionally abused. You know, Janice Harper's work, The Gentle Genocide of Workplace Mobbing, is real. You know, look at what happened in Saskatchewan. You know, and I'm not here to parade my pain or theirs, but I'd like to think that British Columbia can be a world-class leader in in this regard. So we can either learn from our mistakes, like, Einstein says, we can't transform today's problems with yesterday's consciousness.
Mhm.
And when I think of Joyce and I think of the Mi'kmaq and I see they're burning down their workplaces, that's equivalent to a lynching here in Canada. And Canada has the audacity to say, oh, we're not as bad as the US. This isn't the oppression Olympics. We're not going for gold. The work that we do is very difficult. And the answer to your question is, when I'd go into my workplace, I'd have to pray for 10 minutes because this is having an impact on our bodies.
Yeah.
And here's what's interesting. If I believed the messages of workplace violence that was happening to me, I wouldn't be here right now. So, the culture, the spirituality, the collective, one of the things I love about Darla's work is when we sit in front of one another, we connect. And this is about creating a sense of home away from home. And it's a damn shame that I have to be subversive in what my education that I'm trying to impart on young people in my classrooms to teach them how to be more human. So it's the other thing I just want to add, if you don't mind, everyone, is I talked earlier about disenfranchised grief. The ultimate goal of Canada, when I think of Sir John A. Macdonald and Duncan Campbell Scott, was to kill the Indian in me, kill the Indian in my daughter. And it still exists. Even to this day, I have people making decisions on my behalf, education councils, and so on and so forth. So we can do better. I like to think we can do better. And at the same time, we've got to take care of ourselves. We've got to be in community. So these are a couple things that come to mind for me. And yeah,
Well, thank
paddling
you.
together in unison takes a bit of training. And I'm hopeful that this forum, we will learn how to train together in a more authentic way, a compassionate way, because right now with COVID, we're dealing with the extinction grief, anticipatory grief, and the anxiety. I'm not sure about you all, but for me, classroom management is off the charts. Students are asking for record numbers of extensions that I've ever seen in my career. And I just like to think that creating a sense of home is something that we've identified in the looking back to the Potlatch article, creating a learning embassy for every single class that we teach so that people feel connected. And when they feel connected, they'll contribute. And when we're done contributing, we celebrate. So thank you for listening.
A number of pieces there, Eduardo, for you that you can pick up on the canoe metaphor and this idea of being subversive so that we can teach how to be more human. I think there's some work that I think there's probably some pieces in there for you based on earlier conversations that we had. Can you talk a little bit about how you position your work and how you lean into it from your perspective or your position?
Yeah, sure. I think part of the part for me about being human is acknowledging my own shortcomings, my own failures, my own mistakes, my own racism, whether it's internalized racism or it's racism that has emerged in who I am, and that's hard to say that. It's harder still to do it, and I think I often just have to acknowledge that. There's extraordinary privilege in a lot of what I do, right? And who I am as a cisgendered male. Also, as a proud grandchild of Mexican immigrants, I'm light-skinned, and colorism in the United States is a dominant form of oppression still. It's a way that white supremacy manifests itself. And one of my students was wrestling with some of the same issues, and she opened up to me, and we worked on a piece that she submitted and was published. But she put it in a way that I will never forget, and will think about all the time. Is she says, we're sort of living the legacy of colonialism in the way we look, in our like skin tone, right? So you can see the sort of European colonization in who we are, and that lives with us, and it gives us certain privileges. It also it kind of leaves you with some guilt that you have, or at least I have. I shouldn't speak for others. And that, I think, is something that is required, right? If we're all going to be in the canoe and we're all going to be working together, rowing together, we also have to do our own work to see where we can improve and where we can be better partners and better listeners. And so, from my perspective, it's acknowledging the privilege, but also being honest about who I am with colleagues, right? Making my own identity visible, and with students, because I think that space of vulnerability with students helps them see themselves in others, helps them find their voice, and hopefully helps them grow and change these systems from their spheres of influence. So that's a bit of how I'm approaching this on a personal level.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Eddie. Yeah, and I'm going to let the theme continue on to Darla, and give Darla the last few minutes here to maybe put a couple underlines and highlights on some of the experiences and ways that she's thinking about this question as well.
Thanks so much, Todd, and again, many thanks to Justin and Eddie for their comments. And I want to kind of draw on some different pieces that have been shared already, and kind of share where I'm at right now with this. I think the pandemic in particular has emphasized our interconnectedness in ways beyond what we thought would ever be possible, and how much we depend on each other, and our isolation, and our and how much we're not connected with each other. And I think that really has emphasized this all the more. And drawing on, for example, what Justin said about moving beyond dichotomies of us versus them. I think kind of the bigger picture of all of this is that we are all in this together, and some cultures have already, and some persons have already been able to have that mindset shift of from me to we, and there are those countries, such as my own, which are still struggling with what does it mean to be we, that we are in this together. And I'm reminded of kind of two different pieces that are just really sitting with me right now. One comes out of South Africa, the humanist value of Ubuntu, that I am because we are because I am, that we are all indeed interconnected. And this kind of idea resonates and can manifest in other cultures as well. For example, in Indian cultures, different names for this, but one is Buen Vivir, and looking at how we're all interconnected, including with nature. And so I think that emphasis of interconnection is so important now more than ever. And then within that, the other piece that's really sitting with me is looking at what does it mean to be a good neighbor, and really framing this more as neighbors, both local and global. And there are several religions that call for loving one's neighbor as oneself. Confucius said that many ancient years ago. Buddhism talks about how love and compassion are really the ways forward, and without that, humans will not survive. And so what does that really mean in today's world? To be neighbors to each other, to be good neighbors to each other. And I'm reminded by a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., and he said, "The true neighbor will risk position, prestige, and even one's life for the welfare of others." And we see that happening in some places with healthcare workers and so on, really really putting their life on the line for others. But what does that mean for all of us? And kind of even reframing those of us in international education who talk about global citizenship, reframing this in terms of what does it mean to love our local and global neighbors, and to see ourselves in others. And I think that's part of the power of story circles, is that through that sharing, the deep sharing with each other, we do see ourselves in others. And how can we be continually reminded that we are all in this together, and that we need to maybe relearn what it means to learn to live together. And I just wanted to end with another quote from Martin Luther King Jr. He said, "We must learn to live together as brothers, as family, or perish together as fools." And that's a quote that has motivated me for many years and will continue to do so. We have to learn how to live together now more than ever.
Thank you very much. What's really impressed me with today, we started in our heads and we moved to our hearts, and the flow of the day. And what I'd like to just ask, there are a couple questions in the box, but I'd like to ask in the last couple of minutes if anyone has words they'd like to say before we wind up around in the Q&A. Thank you, EJ. In the Q&A around where do we go? Maybe a couple of last thoughts before we close up. Where do we go to ground, to learn, and to restore? Because this work is emotional, because it demands a lot of us as public and private people. Where do we go? Do we have things that we do that help us to ground, and maybe a couple words from each person or if you would like to speak to that, I'll let you speak freely.
Well, if I may, I'll just say that this idea of the circles, the story circles, the community, whatever that community happens to be, is a great source of restoration, of joy for me. So whether it's a community of family, of colleagues, or a community like this, of course it's made so difficult with technology and with having to be physically distant, but I find that whenever my wheels are spinning or my batteries are drained, or I'm feeling that anxiety or the sort of crushing despair of the day, finding community can help. And so this has been a huge help. So I appreciate, again, you, Todd, Justin, and Darla for this.
Thanks, Eddie. Would anyone else like to have the last word on this?
Just picking up on Eddie's word about community, in the end, it seems like that's so key to our existence as humans, and living in beloved community with each other, as Martin Luther King Jr. said. And that includes addressing issues around social justice, really working through the hard issues. And it's not a community devoid of conflict, but we are there together for each other, and we work through it together in beloved community. And I think that's a vision for all of us for the future as we move forward.
Well, thank you, everyone. Today, this has been really meaningful for me, and I hope that to be able to interact with the three of you and share your experiences and your perspectives, and what how you approach your work with all of our community stakeholders. And I look forward to hopefully having future relationship with each one of you as well, and having continuing conversations. And I wonder if EJ would like to wrap up the session and just draw attention, a couple of housekeeping things in this last minute. And but I would just like to say thank you very much to BCCIE, to the three panelists, to Carlene for her gracious welcome, and for the opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to reiterate, I wish we had another hour, to be honest, or more than that to continue this conversation. There were some questions. Thank you for your questions as well that came in. You know, I'm really thinking about that sort of the notion of what it means to be a good neighbor internationally. That kind of settled with me today. Amongst many other things, I might have to review the video myself and the PowerPoints, which will be sent out after the session as well, along with some other documentation. So just in closing, I just want to thank Justin and Darla and Eddie. Thank you so much for spending the time. I feel really lucky that I got to spend a couple sessions before this one talking with you and really listening and learning from all of you, and for providing such an engaging conversation and some real things to think about as we move on. So thank you. To everybody out there, just a reminder that the next session is on November 24th, Building an Inclusive Workplace Through Intercultural Understanding. And I hope that everybody has a good rest of their day and some time to think about everything that was discussed. So thank you again to our panelists. Thank you, Todd, for organizing and getting this together as well. Thanks.